Hello there, lovelies. I'm Random, and today I'm going to be reading The Castaway Foundation from the Castaway series by CirrusGrey. This is a Magnus Archives fanfiction with a rating of teen and up audiences and no archive warnings. The category is male x male with the characters of Martin Blackwood, Jonathan John Sims, and an original non-binary character. The romantic relationships are Martin Blackwood with Jonathan John Sims. The additional tags are post-canon, post-episode E200 last words. This is mainly just intense world building under the guise of a story. Oh well, I got introduced to world somehow. Happy ending. Alternate reality. Mentioned stabbing. Mentioned past death and suffering. Rating is because of those two, even though it's just mentions. This will be a series but will not update regularly. Location, somewhere else. The paramedics found them in the yard of Hilltop Road, clinging to each other and sobbing, still in shock and not quite believing that they had indeed made it out alive. They were taken to a hospital, bandaged and treated for the larger lacerations and bruises from the panopticon's collapse, asked surprisingly few questions about the blood that drenched John's shirt and the healed scar that remained where an injury should be, and left alone in a room with an assurance that someone would be by to speak to them shortly. They sat side by side on the pristine sheets of the hospital cot, hands tangled together, just breathing. "John," Martin ventured after a moment. It was the first word he had managed since crossing between realities, other than a few monosyllabic answers to the nurse's questions, and a breathy, "Thank God," when he'd seen John still alive and breathing in the new world. "Martin," John responded, tightening his grip on his hand. "You are all right, aren't you?" John's heart swelled with warmth. There were so many more urgent matters in his mind, but the fact that that was what Martin asked first, well, it was just very Martin of him. "Yes," he said, lifting his free hand to press against his own chest. He could still feel the sickening pain of the knife going into him, but by the time they had arrived here, the blade had disappeared and the injury had healed. "Are you?" "Yes," Martin said, eyes tracking the movement of John's hand. "Are we really in another world?" "It seems so." He didn't know, and that was reassuring and terrifying in equal measures, but there were subtle hints to it that Martin must have noticed too. Unknown machinery lurking in the corners of the room that wouldn't have existed in a hospital from their own world, and the wail of the ambulance's sirens had carried a different tone from the ones back home. "I don't really know how to handle that," Martin said after a long, silent moment, and John huffed a laugh and leaned into his shoulder. "Me neither," he admitted. "We'll have to figure it out together." "Together," Martin echoed, and John squeezed his hand again. The door opened a few minutes later, letting in a sharply dressed person with an official-looking clipboard. "Oh, hello," they said with a bright smile. "You're new arrivals, then? I heard you came from Hilltop Road. Quite a shock. We didn't even know there was a rift there. Margot from accounting is going to be so smug about it. She's been saying we're due one year London for a while." John exchanged a baffled look with Martin as the person rifled through the pages on their clipboard, then pulled out a pen from their pocket and clicked it open briskly. "Now, before we begin, I do need to ask, was your goal releasing the fears to spread them to other worlds, or to simply save your own? It's just that I have to call some extra security if it's the former." John's mouth dropped open in soundless shock at the mention of the fears, and he barely even processed the question. Martin beside him fared a little better. "Sorry, what, he stuttered, then, we were trying to save the world." "Excellent. Good job," the official murmured, taking a note on their clipboard. They looked up, giving John and Martin a bright smile. "Now, could I have your names and pronouns, please?" "Martin Blackwood," Martin said, once again beating John to coherency. He/him. "Jonathan Sims." "John." "He/him," John echoed after a moment. "Great," the official said, making another note, then removed the sheet of paper they had been writing on and brandished it in the air. Right then, I'll just leave this over here. You can fill it in later with the rest of your personal information. Birthdays, any legal titles you'd like to be recognized, that sort of thing. They set it on a table to the side, along with the pen they had been using, and fetched another from their pocket. This one they uncapped with their teeth and stuck the cap in a different pocket once it was loose. Oh, and I'm Rufus Amesley, they, them. It's nice to meet you. They gave another winning smile before flipping to a new page on the clipboard. I've just got a few questions to ask. So, what did you call the fears in your world? Names, titles, anything of that sort? This question John could answer without thinking, no matter how confused it still was. The hunt, he said. The end, the dark, the spiral, the eye. Ah, Rufus said, interrupting him. I'm gonna stop you right there. Smirks 14, yes? What? Yes, John said, once again thrown in bafflement. I'm sorry, how, we've been getting a lot of those recently. Jonah Magnus, right? Martin's hand tightened around John's hard enough to hurt, but he didn't blame him. His own had just clamped down as well. How do you know that name? He asked, voice dark with a tone that should have compelled an answer, but it didn't. He couldn't feel the eye at all. Like I said, we've been getting a lot of drop-throughs from Magnus Worlds recently, Rufus said, not noticing their distress. Must have been a pretty nasty bastard to cause all this. Right, so that means you've got the 14 controlled by the web, kicked off by the eye, and one of you must be... Rufus stopped ticking boxes on their clipboard, peered at John and Martin for a moment. The archivist, they finished, pointing their pen at John, and made another tick. Say, you don't happen to know a guy called Jared Key, do you? John and Martin both spluttered for a moment. John found his voice first. Jerry? Oh, so you do know him, Rufus said, sounding delighted. No, John said. No, well, I mean, we met once. And then I killed him, he didn't add. He figured it would send the wrong message. Besides, out of all the deaths on his hands, Jerry's was the only one that didn't weigh on his conscience. Right, Rufus mused, looking a bit disappointed. Nice fellow, a bit gloomy. Can't really blame him, always comes through alone. Poor chap. Anyways, there's been about a dozen of him dropping in recently. Figured you might have run into him at some point. They're actually starting a band if you're into that kind of thing. Sorry, Martin said, with a light sort of laugh in his voice that John recognized and near hysterical. Sorry, Rufus, was it? I'm sorry, but what is going on? Oh, Rufus blinked at him for a moment, thrown off their train of thought, and then their eyes widened. Oh, I do apologize. I haven't explained anything, have I? I just came right in with my questions. I'm so sorry. I haven't done one of these in a few months. I'm forgetting myself. They stood up straighter and cleared their throat. Well, as I said, my name is Rufus, and I work with the Castaway Foundation. The words were delivered dramatically. John and Martin both stared at them, uncomprehending. Sorry, John asked after a moment. What's the Castaway Foundation? The Castaway Foundation is, Rufus began, then paused. First, let me just establish, you are aware that you have fallen through into a new dimension, correct? A new reality completely separate from the one you've known. Yes, Martin said at the same time John said, How do you know that? They smiled. The Castaway Foundation is an organization dedicated to helping individuals like yourselves. Our world is, well, you know the rift you fell through at Hilltop Road? John and Martin both nodded. Well, in all likelihood, it was unique, or near unique, in the world you came from. Just one point where the walls of reality were thinner, allowing passage between worlds. Most reality are like that. They have just one weak spot. In this world, however, Rufus gestured with one hand, taking in the space around them. We have a lot more. It's been speculated that every rift between worlds opens up here. Actually, we're sort of a way station, a midway, a central hub, if you will. Anything that passes between realities has to come through here first before moving on. The wood between the worlds, Martin murmured, and Rufus smiled and made a note on their clipboard. Well, I see you have Narnia in your world. Yes, that's it exactly, and as such, we tend to end up getting a lot of drop-ins. Folks like yourselves who make the jump from their world into this one, but don't get carried along to the next. And the Castaway Foundation was established to help you all find your place here, transition into your new reality. We have a lot of resources to get you settled in, from financial assistance to cultural adjustment to... Their eyes lingered on the blood staining John's and Martin's clothes. Therapy. So wait, John said, the implications of this finally setting in. You said you had about a dozen Jerrys? Yes, Ruffa said, just over the last 5 years or so. Like I said, the activity from Magnus Worlds has been really heating up recently, all those timelines hitting their crisis points at once. Before that, most of the activity was in America. Apparently those worlds had diverged quite far from our own by the time they had reached the apocalypse. John felt himself blanch. Beside him, Martin gasped. "Oh gods," he said, voice shaking. "The fears." Ruffas raised their eyebrows, took in their petrified expressions. Oh no, don't worry about it. It's not a problem." What? "The apocalypse," Ruffa said. "Listen, yes, I know you're probably feeling a lot of conflicting emotions over releasing the fears from your world, but let me be the first to assure you that you made the right choice." Their voice dipped low, comforting. "I know me saying this isn't going to ease the stress of the decision, but like I said, there are therapists ready and waiting to help take this weight off your shoulders. There are many different versions of the fears out there. They've been released from one world or another 1,000 times. You didn't really affect the, They waved a hand in the air, searching for the words. "The cosmic balance of fears across realities, aside from saving your own. You've done a good thing, even if it doesn't feel that way." But this world," Martin said. "The fears, the apocalypse, we're a way station," Rufus said, shrugging. "They don't stick around here for more than a few minutes. Sure, we've had our fair share of short-lived apocalypses over the years, but they mostly just pass straight through this point, you know? No one who lives here is really afraid of them at this point. We all know it'll pass, so they just tend to move on to greener pastures immediately. After dropping off the people who might be inclined to burn out the next world to stop them, of course," they finished with a significantly raised eyebrow at John and Martin. Martin let out a long, slow breath, the tension easing from his shoulders, but all John could feel was a sick, stricken feeling building in the pit of his stomach. "I am," he began. "So sorry, Martin." The words caught in his throat, shaking with grief and guilt. I lied to you. I went behind your back. I betrayed the group's trust and all for nothing, for a plan that would have killed the world, for nothing. All I've done is get us banished from our own reality. Rufus interrupted, long and drawn out, and John stopped, startled, to look at them. "Not to butt in here, but we've had a few arrivals that have stumbled through the rifts, post-apocalypse, as it were." They gave a meaningful tilt of their head. "And let's just say, from what they've told us, it doesn't tend to go very well for former avatars once their patrons are no longer protecting them. You probably saved both your lives by coming through to our world." "Oh," John said, stopped dead in the middle of his guilt spiral, and Rufus smiled and continued on. "Now, there are several questions we have to go over, just basic facts of your world, also we can figure out where it diverged from others. Let's see." They tapped the pen on their clipboard. "Magnus means you're sharing at least up to his first attempt at the Panopticon. What year did the moon landing happen for you?" 1960. John and Martin both began on instinct. They stopped, blinking at each other. Martin gestured for John to continue. 69, he finished. "Sorry, but why 69? Excellent. That's the same with Jerry's. How about the internet? Do you have the internet?" "Yes," Martin said. "Why wouldn't we? And what year was that?" "Early 90s, John said. "You still haven't told us, in what year did the first human walk on Mars?" Silence. Rufus stared at them for a moment and smiled. "Has the first human walked on Mars?" "No," Martin said slowly. "Should they have?" "It's not a matter of should, just a matter of if," Rufus said cheerfully. "Backtracking a little from that, then, Do you have rickrolling in your world? Rickrolling? John spluttered at the same time Martin choked out a what? What does rickrolling have to do with anything? He continued. We found it's a significant turning point in human history, Rufus said calmly, making another note on their clipboard. We don't really know why. Yes, we have rickrolling, John said, shaking his head. He distinctly remembered Tim spending an entire week trying to rickroll the whole archives when Martin was living there in an attempt to cheer everyone up. He was pretty sure he'd also heard a rumor of Sasha hacking into the Institute's public webpage and sending the links there to redirect to the video as well. From the soft, nostalgic look in Martin's eyes, John figured he was remembering the same thing. More immediate changes, then. Who was the archivist before you, and what year did you take over the position? Gertrude Robinson, John said. 2015. Rufus paused, shoulders slumping. Jerry didn't get the treatment he needed then. No, John said quietly as he realized what they meant. No, he did not. Rufus sighed, a small, resigned thing, and shook their head. Well, no matter. Yours is certainly not the first world to lose him early. They took a moment more of quiet solemnity before hoisting their smile back onto their face. So, Magnus murdered Miss Robinson, correct? We've had a scattered few folks coming through from similar timelines. I won't ask why you were chosen as her replacement. From what I've seen, it's a roll of the dice what qualities Magnus and the web decide are important in his next archivist. Just rest assured, whatever it wasn't your fault. You've probably lived out the same life 1,000 times over in different worlds and never even caught his eye. No pun intended. Martin gave a quiet snort, then leaned into John's shoulder. He didn't say anything, but John knew what he meant. See? I told you it wasn't your fault. John leaned back, even though he couldn't believe the reassurances. If, in 1,000 worlds, 1,000 different Jonathan Simses had slipped under the radar and lived out their lives without even drawing the attention of Jonah Magnus, surely that meant he had done something different, made a mistake that put him at the center of things. I have to say, you're rather lucky to come from a popular timeline, Rufus told them, cutting off their guilt-laden thoughts. We already have most of the details of your world logged into our system, so we'll be able to funnel you towards the correct resources immediately. We had one tether, they said, came through about 5 years ago. I never met her, of course. I think she appeared in the Maldives. But from what I've heard, her world split so far in the past that it took them a full week to even start translating between her language and one of ours. The linguistic bases had diverged so long ago that they had to approach it as a completely alien tongue. Really? Martin said, fascinated, then paused. Wait, sorry, tether? What's that mean? Oh, of course. My apologies. I meant to explain earlier. You see, we've had a lot of different apocalypses passing through with all sorts of causes and consequences. All of them are unique in their own ways, but we've found that there are several similarities between them. So we've created a sort of checklist, as it were, to keep track, with titles for each role that needs to be filled. Coming from a Magnus world, I've been able to tick off a lot of them already, see? They turned their clipboard around, flipping to a page with a neat list on it, then started pointing out the items with the tip of their pen. The mastermind, that's the fear that wants to spread to other realities, was the web. The ascendant, the fear that actually rules the apocalypse, that was the eye. It's funny, Rufus mused, but those two are rarely the same thing. We've only had maybe 5 unique realities where the mastermind makes themselves the ascendant. Not sure why. Anyways, then there's the catalyst, which is whatever human decides they actually want the apocalypse to happen. That was Jaina Magnus for you. The catalyst often overlaps with other 2 roles, the conduit and the tether. The conduit is the one that brings the fear through into a world. The tether is the one that binds them there. Magnus world conduits have, so far, all carried the title of archivist, and we haven't had any where Magnus himself takes that role. He does make himself the original tether, though. I'm assuming one of you had to kill him to take on the role yourself? Here Rufus paused and gave them a searching look. It's not always the conduit who becomes the tether once the original is taken away, they said. but judging from the respective amount of blood on your clothes, I'm guessing you, pointing at John, were the tether, and you, pointing at Martin, were the one to cut it? John winced ever so slightly at the reminder, but it was nothing compared to the full-bodied flinch Martin gave, jolting where he sat. His hands clamped around John's hard enough to hurt. "John," he managed to say, sounding breathless and pained, and John pulled his hand free so that he could wrap both his arms around Martin's shoulders and drag him into a hug. "I'm here," he said fiercely. "I'm okay." The look he shot at Rufus over Martin's shoulder was probably unfairly accusatory. Yes, it's okay, Martin, John. It is quite normal to have to stab a loved one at the end of the apocalypse. We've seen it 100 times. We'll get you both counseling for it soon." Martin scoffed, aggressive and tear-laden, into John's shoulders. "I somehow doubt you've got a therapist who specializes in, I stabbed my partner to save the world because we both acted without the other's knowledge and almost got us both killed," he said somewhat viciously. We do, actually. Her name is Caitlin." Martin went dead still for a moment, frozen in John's arms. Then he started laughing, loud and near hysterical. "Of course you do. Of course you do." Rufus smiled again ever so slightly. "As I said, we at the Foundation have seen it all before." They fetched a cap for their pen, a cap John would almost swear was a different one that they had before. Out of their pocket, capped the pen and tucked it in the clipboard under their arm. "In 100 different variations over 1,000 different worlds. You're in good hands with us, and I know you're still in shock right now, so none of this is really going to sink in. But keep it at the back of your mind, if nothing else, that things are going to get better for you. You have been through literal hell, and I cannot even begin to imagine the suffering you must have felt. But it's over now. It's done. You've survived, and your future is bright." Martin nodded, sagging heavier into John's arms and breathing deeply as the hysteria bled away. John held him tightly and tried not to cry. He didn't know if he could believe in a bright future, didn't know if he deserved a bright future after all he'd done, but he could try, at least for now, for Martin's sake. Rufus tactfully stepped back, flipping through the pages on their clipboard for a few minutes as John and Martin pulled themselves together. When they had wiped away the dampness from their eyes, stopped clinging to each other like the world would end if they let go, and sat up, the clipboard was set aside again. "Now, you'll be able to choose your permanent housing arrangements later, but for the moment, you've got a room booked in a hotel nearby that you can stay in for the night. I'll be just down the hall from you if you need to talk about anything. Unless you have any objections, I recommend you rest and recuperate there until tomorrow, and then in the morning we can all drive back to London and get you settled in at the Foundation proper. How does that sound?" John looked at Martin, and Martin nodded. "All right," John said, his voice sounding as ragged and wrung out as he felt. "I'll call us a taxi, then," Rufus said, and made to leave the room. "Wait," Martin called, and they paused. "Before you go, if you really had so many drop-ins from other worlds like ours, are there—" He took a hesitant breath. "Has Jonah himself ever come through? Is he here?" John tensed, fear flooding through him at the thought, but Rufus was already shaking their head. "No," they said. "Magnus can't survive being the tether. We've had a few dead bodies dropping in that the other archivists have identified as him, but it seems your eye has no interest in keeping him alive. Archivists, yes, it heals all of you before passing on to other worlds. Not him." A knot of tight fear unspooled from John's chest, a knot that he hadn't even realized he was carrying, and he let out a breath in aching relief. It was over. Martin's arm found its way around his waist, and he sank into it, leaning into Martin's side like a puppet with its strings cut. In a very real way, he was. "We're going to be all right," Martin said quietly, sounding like he was only starting to believe it himself, and John shocked himself by agreeing. "Yeah, I think we are." Rufus nodded, stepping towards the door again. "I'll be back to get you when the taxi arrives. Until then, just take some time to relax. Oh, and John, Martin?" They flashed a grin, delivering their parting remarks just before leaving the room. "Welcome to your new world." When I listened to the Magnus Archives, because I listened to it twice, I would not shut up about it. And it got so bad that now, whenever I mention the Magnus Archives, my friends will just scream no very loudly so that I don't talk about it. Which means that I will mention the Magnus Archives at every opportunity I get, because why wouldn't I? Also, I forgot I had recorded something for July, so I was like terrified that this would not come out in time. But anyways, the story belongs to CirrusGrey on AO3, and the footstep sound effect belongs to Knox Sound from freesound.com. The other sound effects are mine. Proper credits will still be in the description, and don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment. The kind words really help to get my ass in gear and actually make these things. I thought they wouldn't. I underestimated the power of human words, but it really does help. Thank you. Catch you guys next time. Bye.